So perhaps we'll work through it together. So we just saw the video, had a bit of a spiel. What was the context that God gave this prophecy to Ezekiel in? What had just happened to the Israelite people of Judah, to their nation? Why did it happen?
They were taken away into Babylon.
Yep.
So,
And why did it happen?
because they just turned against the Lord and they wouldn't listen.
Sin.
So they came,
Yep.
and then ultimately the temple was destroyed.
Yep. Exactly. And so now God brings them to this valley of dry bones. How does God explain what this valley represents? What do the dry bones represent? It says in there, God said what they are.
Just the people.
The whole land of Israel, isn't it? Gone and dead. What does breathing new life into them represent again? What does God say it represents?
Holy Spirit.
Yeah.
Back into them.
That's,
Spirit
I think
of
we're
God.
getting to the next few questions.
Yeah.
What does God say it represents in there?
Well, it's clear that dry bones in this context are not just Israel, but in what the people say, our hope is lost, we
That's
are cut
right,
off.
yeah.
So it's the exiled Israel that the dried bones represent. And so
Yep.
breathing life back into them in this immediate context would be a restoration to
Right.
the promised land.
So that's right. So, and what happened 70 years later? The Persian king, emperor, let them go back. And Jerusalem was rebuilt and Israel became a nation again. So God is going to breathe life, or was going to breathe life back into the exiles who were faithful to him and bring them back to the land. So that's the simple reading of it. That's what the prophecy meant to Ezekiel and the people at the time. But there's clearly deeper meaning in that, isn't there? Again, like all prophecy, there's often multiple meanings. And I think, Rose, you were touching at that. So in light of Jesus and Pentecost, how can we then interpret this passage?
It's very interesting what it says in verse 12 about opening up graves
Yes.
and bringing you up from them.
When did that happen?
Happened when Jesus was raised.
Happened when Jesus was raised, didn't it?
That 500 people were raised with him.
So there's something in there, isn't there, about the
Yeah.
cross
Yeah.
and what
New life.
the cross meant. There's something spiritual there about new life and forgiveness of sins and breath of life and the Holy Spirit making us new people and bringing us back. Then take it one step further in the light of Revelation. How can we add a third layer to this?
Those that died and rise up first.
Exactly. We've got people rising from the dead. We've got the resurrection of all of us one day being brought to real life for eternity into heaven. So there's a lot of layers in this prophecy. And so when reading it, we can see all those layers and it adds a real depth and richness
It's
to
so
it.
interesting how it all comes together.
It is, isn't it?
I like that.
Ezekiel's a really good book, but that last 8 chapters of the temple I found very difficult to read when I've only read it once.
You can
Yeah.
see how strong an influence Ezekiel has on Revelation.
You really can. There's a lampstand discussion and everything. Yep.
Yeah, and the temple, measuring the temple, and
Yep.
all this sort of
And that brings us to apocalyptic literature. And we'll get through this in 5 or 10 minutes because there's no videos to watch. So apocalyptic literature is a special type of prophetic literature where there are visions being brought by a heavenly messenger about the end times. And there's plenty of apocalyptic literature that is not in the Bible, that comes from 200, 300, 100 BC. And in the Bible, the apocalyptic literature is primarily Daniel 7 to 12 and the book of Revelation. It just has a different feel to it than some of the other prophecy, and it's about end times. And there's other parts of other prophets that have some apocalypse in it as well. And apocalyptic literature tends to have determinism. It's looking at the whole of history and God is determining it. As well as visions, the revelation is coming through visions, and there's a lot of symbolism in apocalyptic literature and numbers which have particular meanings. And understanding those symbols helps us understand the meaning a bit better. So Revelation's the key apocalyptic book that we think of. Remember, Revelation now is a New Testament book. This is the last book of the Bible. And it was the last book written as well as the Bible, probably about 90 AD. And it was written to the church. It was a vision to the church. And that was a time when the church was being persecuted by Roman emperors because the Romans believed in lots of gods and the emperor wanted to be treated like one. And Christians would only worship God and Jesus. And there was a lot of persecution to the point of people being thrown into the lions or burnt alive. It was the first 300 years of the church, what it was like living then. So that was the context that God gave the visions, the apocalyptic visions of Revelation to. And they were the people that were meant to be the first hearers of it. It's a book which is full of visions that have lots of very, very bizarre and difficult to understand images. Lions and lambs and horsemen and death and complicated visions that are really hard, and symbols that are really hard to understand. But you get an emotional impression in the visions of good and bad and evil. And it's very, very... I put this up in the sermon a few weeks ago, this slide. It's a very, very controversial book on how to interpret it. So this is where humility is extra important and caution is extra important. But I'm just going to go through the 4 different ways of understanding Revelation. And just to put it out there, I sit in the idealist view. Most Christians today sit in the futurist or idealist view. If you go back to the Reformation, most Christians sat in the historicist view. Who knows which one is right? Perhaps a combination of all of them, perhaps none of them. But these are the 4 ways that you can try and interpret Revelation, and your view that you take definitely has an influence on how you understand Revelation. So the first view is the preterist view. That's where the visions described in Revelation relate to the cross, so 30 AD about, up to the fall of Jerusalem. So Jerusalem was rebuilt after the exile, and Jesus obviously lived in Jerusalem, or spent time in Jerusalem, but then the Jewish nation was totally destroyed in 70 AD by the Roman Empire, and gone until 1947 or 48. And so the preterist view is that the visions described, actually, even though the visions were from 95 AD, the visions are describing what happened between the cross and the fall of Jerusalem. And every vision can link up to specific historical events. And I guess that's the view that people that, well, it's a view that a Christian might take or a non-Christian might take. They might say John's describing the events that happened in visions. The historicist view, on the other hand, is that the visions relate to specific events in history. So you can find a vision and say, that was this event in history. And, and it goes through in chronological order to the present. And so the historicist view was common in the Reformation, where they put a lot of the visions and said, oh, that's when the Pope did this. That's when the church did this. And up to today, and who knows where we're up to, maybe we're up to Revelation chapter 18 today, I don't know where we're up to in that view. But people say there's specific visions mean specific events.
Well, there's probably multiple versions of the historicist.
Oh, there are, of course. Yeah. Then there's the futurist view, and this is really common in particularly the American evangelical churches. And this is relatively new, I think. This is really a 20th century interpretation of Revelation, more so. This is the view that actually Revelation is talking about end time into the future. Sometime in the future, and none of it's happened yet, but it's to come. And there will be specific events that happen in the future that are being described. And that's often quite a literal view of Revelation is taken, where 7 years is 7 years, 1,000 years is 1,000 years. So that's a really, really common view.
Is that like that Hal Lindsey sort of thing?
I'll say again.
Hal Lindsey, he wrote about the rapture. And
Yeah, that's right. That's the rapture sort of view.
Yeah.
And that's very, very common. Probably the more common view in evangelical Christians today, I think. And then there's the idealist view, which was very common with the early church fathers like Augustine, and is reasonably common view held today, that you can't work out too much about Revelation. The visions don't correspond one-to-one to historical events. They represent ideas and concepts and themes to do with good and evil, with God overcoming Satan, with everything that's been happening from the cross up to now, up to when there is finally the new creation. But you can't map it out. I just find this makes the most sense to me for my style of thinking, and also means that you don't have to try to understand everything. But they're all views that different Christians hold. And so when we try to understand apocalypse, these are some just suggestions. We should be modest in our goals. We shouldn't try to understand everything. If we don't understand it, we don't understand it. We don't have to try and make it fit. We should remember when it was written and who it was written to. It was written at a time that the church was being persecuted, people were suffering for their faith. It was written to encourage people that God would overcome, that their suffering wasn't going to be forever, that eventually there would be an end to their suffering and God would right wrongs. So remembering that's important when we interpret it. And it's worth trying to just establish the general thrust of the passage. What's God saying overall in a passage we read to his suffering people? It's worth looking at the symbols, the numbers, take them seriously, but I think not too literally. And often, for example, 7, take it seriously. It's really important. 7 was put there for a reason, but we don't necessarily need to take it literally. 7 often is an idea of complete. Just like 6 is often an idea of evil in the apocalyptic literature. So it may not mean that specific number. It might just mean that number is used to represent a particular idea. Same with some of the other symbols. It's worth asking, how did the readers back in 100 AD understand it? How do we think they understood it? And
that's why we had pictures and parallels, and it was easier.
Yeah.
It was easier to relate to.
Yeah. And as always, with all prophecy, let's approach it humbly, and let's not make too many quick judgments about what the meaning is without really thinking about it first.
An example of how easy it is to go wrong with that is, when I was a kid, it was popular to say that credit cards were the mark of the beast.
I remember that. And then you'd be getting it on your implanted chip into your finger. I remember that and thinking that when I was a kid.
Can I add something there though?
Yeah.
I started to go to church by myself as we were a couple, because Sash used to have about 3 or 4 jobs to make him meet. He wanted me to stay home with the kids. So we were invited to watch this video on Barry Smith on End Times. This guy came to the Lord.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
God uses everything,
it
doesn't
had
he?
its purpose.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it may be right, some of
It
these
still
things.
won't come.
Yeah.
I mean, you're
We
looking
don't
at
know.
microchips in animals and so forth. I mean, it's all.
I'm carrying one on my watch right now and taking things that way.
I mean, he was so excited because he kind of came across as a school teacher, so he had kind of a really interesting way, and he responded to him.
Yeah.
And he went out and bought a Bible, and I'm thinking,
I couldn't
That's
read
awesome.
the one I
that
was
would
a
be
kid.
the last sort of thing that I would
Yeah.
think that would convert someone, but
But
it
it
really
does.
touched him.
It's like tracks that are left by
Yeah.
people. They convert
So-
people. They make a difference.
It
God-
makes you think.
Yep.
And makes you start to question what you really believe in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so it was good.
And I guess it's not understanding everything that's really important. It's us searching
Yeah.
that's
Taking
important.
it seriously.
God says, knock and
And
I'll
seek me and you'll find
I'll
me.
knock and seek and find. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Can you
whether
just
we
go
could
back to your previous...
that one.
No,
That one.
that one, yes. I mean, I think everything you've said there is absolutely correct. But unfortunately, let's say you were being interviewed to be the minister of a church in America, especially some Baptist churches. You'd get such questions as, are you a pre-tribulationist or a post-tribulationist? Are you an amillennialist, a millennialist, or a premillennialist? And depending upon your answer, you would be considered acceptable or not acceptable to be a minister in
I
that
know.
sort of
No,
church.
that's okay. That's okay. You just answer honestly and truthfully.
No, what I'm
Yeah.
saying is because
They
Yeah.
have
They are-
preconceived ideas.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
Yeah, so they don't allow for a variety of opinion in
Yeah.
these topics. And a variety of opinion in these topics is so important, which is why, if you look at our website, this is up for review, of course, from everyone. We've got our core beliefs. We've got a section then on secondary beliefs with different opinions that people have and say it's okay to have different beliefs. And then we've got a section on important social issues. So I think that's right.
If you're pre or post, who cares?
Exactly. All right. So I think that's it for the night. Any final comments, thoughts, questions?
So you've also,
Oh, go ahead.
you've also got in Matthew, haven't you, at the end of Matthew, 25 and 26.
Dude, that's apocalyptic, isn't it?
Yeah.
Definitely.
I was a bit excited last night. We had our neighbour come over, and they're not Christian. He was raised a Catholic. She
Doesn't
didn't have
practice.
any background. And they've got this little prep that started at Hillcrest. Well, this little girl is preaching the word to her preps. So she apparently, he told us last night that she sat in the bath and she said, Dad, do you know that God made everything? And he made it in 7 days, and he made me. And Dad, do you know that Sunday he had a day off? Don't you think that's a good idea? And he was telling us this, but it was so beautiful. I thought, here's this little girl, had no exposure. And he said, this school is amazing. It's giving us so much. And, you know, there's something kind of spiritual happening. And I just got so excited, and I thought, here's this little
Isn't that fantastic?
kid, and I thought it was beautiful.
That's that reminds me of there's a controversial passage in 2 Timothy which says women will be saved through childbearing.
Yeah.
And my take, whether this is true or not, I don't know, is that's talking about kids bringing their parents back to God.
Yeah.
Because I
I
see
thought it
so
was
many
so
people who are
gorgeous.
my age having kids who have lost their faith and come back and say, oh, I want my kid to have some sort of moral upbringing. I better bring them to
But
church.
you know
I
what?
better go to church.
You know what
Yeah.
too? That he said that we were watching her and she was saying, there are certain things, Dad, that is just not nice, and this is not how you treat people. And I thought,
Isn't that
isn't
beautiful?
that fantastic? So the message, even to a little prep, is getting through.
That's fantastic. It's a
Look,
good school,
I think
isn't
that's
it?
dead right. Say, for example, with not just Hillcrest, but St Andrews and all the others, you're looking at 70% of the kids don't
I
come
know.
from Christian
Yeah.
families.
It's true, yeah.
And the beauty is that kids take things seriously,
They do.
and
It's
It's-
just gorgeous.
It's awesome.
that challenges their parents and other adults around.
Yeah.
Yep. If you want to read a book on understanding prophecy, because I know you've all got plenty of time, this is a book that I've read that I thought was really helpful and really interesting. And it helped me shape my understanding of prophecy in a more healthy way, I think. So it's called Plowshares and Pruning Hooks, because God will shape our spears into plowshares and pruning hooks. Worth reading.
So just for those who aren't from a farming background, give us the definition of a ploughshare. They're like the round things on the...
I think a plowshare is...
It's the sharp part of the plough that I
It
think
cuts.
makes
It
the
cuts
cuts
the
a
furrow.
furrow.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
I don't know what a pruning hook is though, but there is a
Pruning
passage.
fork is when you're with the hay.
Okay, of
That's
course.
the hay. Fork.
And that comes from a passage in
Is it
Isaiah where God says that He'll turn
The
swords and spears
spears.
into
Into
plowshares and pruning hooks.
Yeah.
So He's going to take war and turn it into peace.
That's great. Thanks, Graham.